Hi, we are the Planned Change Group, and today we are going to be presenting on building healthy relationships to end violence, specifically looking at children who are exposed to domestic violence. If you grow up around domestic violence, it doesn't always feel wrong. It can start to feel normal. And that's really where the issue begins. Children learn what relationships look like from what they experience. So when violence is part of their environment, it can shape how they understand conflict, control, and even love. This isn't a small issue either. About 1 in 10 children in the United States are exposed to domestic violence each year, which shows how widespread this problem really is. The grand challenge we are focusing on is build healthy relationships to end violence. The grand challenge is about preventing violence before it starts by promoting safe, healthy, and nonviolent relationships across the life course. It recognizes that violence isn't just an individual issue, it's something that impacts families, communities, and future generations. For our project, we're applying this specifically to children exposed to domestic violence because what they experience early on can shape the kinds of relationships they accept or repeat later in life. Why this matters, a social justice issue. The issue is also a social justice concern because children are not equally exposed to violence and they're not equally supported when they experience it. Children in under-resourced communities are more likely to be exposed to domestic violence due to structural and systemic factors like poverty, housing instability, and community stress. At the same time, those communities often have fewer resources available, including access to mental health care and early intervention programs. So the children who are most affected are often the least supported. When trauma goes unanswered, it doesn't just go away. It continues, and that's what allows the cycle of violence to keep repeating. So this is not just a private family issue, it's a broader issue connected to inequality, access, and prevention. The impact of domestic violence exposure. When we look at the impact of domestic violence exposure, we can see both short-term and long-term effects. In the short term, children may experience emotional distress like fear, anxiety, or confusion. You may also see behavioral changes such as aggression or withdrawal, along with difficulty regulating emotions and focusing in school. Over time, the impact becomes more ingrained. Children may begin to normalize unhealthy or even violent relationships because that is what they have been exposed to. Research shows that children exposed to violence are more likely to experience or engage in violence later in life. So what starts as exposure in childhood can turn into patterns that carry into adulthood, continuing the cycle. Our condition statement. Children exposed to domestic violence are at an increased risk of normalizing unhealthy relationships, contributing to the intergenerational cycle of violence due to lack of early intervention, trauma-informed support, and exposure to healthy relational models. This really brings everything together. It identifies the population, the risk, and the key reason the cycle continues. So now that we've defined the problem and who it impacts, the next step is understanding why the cycle continues. The systems of oppression, economic inequality, limited financial resources can trap families in abusive environments and restrict their access to safe housing, counseling, and legal support. Racism and systemic bias. Communities of color often face barriers to culturally competent services and may experience disproportionate surveillance rather than supportive measures. Gender inequality. Domestic violence is rooted in power and control, often reflecting broader societal norms that normalize male dominance. Age-based power dynamic. Children have a limited autonomy and are often excluded from decisions about the safety and well-being of their family. Institutional barriers. Schools and community programs may lack funding, training, or trauma-informed practices to effectively support exposed youth. Children ages 8 to 14 exposed to domestic violence are impacted by multiple overlapping systems of oppression.
So before we can talk about solutions, we have to understand what is underneath the issue. Domestic violence and children's exposure to it usually do not come from one single cause. It often grows out of a deeper structural, family, and social factors working together. One major root cause is intergenerational trauma. When violence is learned, witnessed, or normalized across generations, it can become repeated unless there is intervention and support. That does not mean that families are destined to repeat harm, but it does mean that patterns can continue when people do not have access to healing, education, or healthier models of conflict. Another root cause is societal norms around violence and control. Media, cultural messages, and historical patterns can sometimes reinforce the idea that power, dominance, or aggression are acceptable ways to handle conflict. In domestic violence specifically, abuse is often about maintaining control, not just the anger. Economic instability also plays a major role. Poverty, unemployment, and housing insecurity can increase stress inside families and limit a person's ability to leave unsafe situations. These pressures do not excuse violence, but they can increase risk and make it harder for families to find safety. A lack of accessible mental health care is another important factor. Untreated trauma, substance use, and mental health challenges can contribute to harmful family dynamics, especially when services are expensive, unavailable, or stigmatized. So overall, this issue is rooted in more than just an individual barrier. It connects to trauma, societal norms, economic stress, and access to care, and unequal power structures. That is why responses need to go beyond punishment alone and include prevention, support, safety, and community-level resources.
And there are also multiple factors that keep these root causes going, such as several systemic and structural factors allow domestic violence exposure to persist for children. Underreporting and stigma, fear, shame, and mistrust of systems prevent families from seeking help. Inconsistent school and community response. Educators and staff may not be trained to identify or respond appropriately to these situations. You have limited access to services. Long wait lists, cost barriers, and lack of transportation reduce access to support. There's also policy gaps, inadequate funding for prevention programs and child-focused interventions. There are legal and custody challenges. Systems may prioritize parental rights over child safety in some cases, and continued exposure environments. Children often return to the same unsafe settings without sustained intervention. So for our research findings, we found that 15.5 million children are exposed to domestic violence every year. Nearly half of the residents supported through domestic violence and family violence prevention programs are children. Children who witness domestic violence are far more likely to develop things such as insomnia, bedwetting, verbal, motor, and cognitive issues, learning difficulties, self-harm, aggression, antisocial behaviors, depression, anxiety, and also poor emotional regulation. Boys who witness domestic violence in the home are more likely to grow up to become perpetrators themselves, while girls are more likely to become victims. So currently in the United States, there are 74 million children. 15.5 million of those children actively witness domestic violence in their homes. That is 20.9% of children in the United States that witness domestic violence. That is a staggering statistic. And boys who witness domestic violence are 3 times more likely to abuse their own partners and children as adults. This is more likely to happen for them than other boys who grow up in homes without domestic violence, because often it is the only experience they have with families. It is all that they know. It is all that they are socialized to understand relationships to be. So they are 3 times more likely to grow up and become perpetrators themselves. There are 2 current interventions that are the most popular to be used with children who witness domestic violence. One of them is trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy. It is an evidence-based therapeutic intervention focused on helping children process trauma, negative emotions, and feelings, and also develop coping skills. This is often used for children that are pulled from these situations. It can be used for situations where the children end up going back into the home to help them process. But often it is for children who are pulled from these situations. The other one is child-parent psychotherapy. It's a therapeutic intervention aimed at young children to just strengthen the relationship between parent and child, enhance safety, and process trauma together. This is often between the child and the parent that is the victim of domestic violence. It attempts to help strengthen their bond and help them process trauma together, as often in these situations, children can become estranged and have strained relationships with both parents, regardless of who is the victim and who is the perpetrator. So there are multiple gaps and problems with this social problem, but one of the 2 biggest ones are studies often lack consistent definitions and research into children who witness domestic violence, as only physical domestic violence and abuse are considered as variables. In pretty much every single study that I looked into for this project, there was no mention of non-physical domestic violence. Every statistic that you can find, almost all of them only record physical domestic violence. It is significantly harder to measure non-physical domestic violence in these homes, which means that the statistics that we do have, that 15.5 million children, is likely significantly larger because we are unable to measure the exact number when you include non-physical domestic violence as a part of this number. The other gap and problem is in situations where children are not direct victims of abuse in the home, they are often overlooked and do not receive any intervention to address their needs. Since they are not active victims of any sort of abuse that you can see, they are often not treated for any psychological problems. And this is how we end up having so many children that have these depression, anxiety, and all these other psychological problems, because they are overlooked. And it can be hard to identify, because especially in education, teachers do not have the means to understand that something could be happening at home when there's not any physical signs that something is wrong, only psychological. Our hypothesis is children who grow up in environments where they witness domestic violence are more likely to develop psychological issues and grow up and become victims or perpetrators themselves. These children often fall through the cracks and grow up to have these significant psychological issues, or grow up to become victims or perpetrators because they're often overlooked.
So building off of Kara's point about the gap in current interventions, we're proposing a new program. Our program is called Safe Roots, Building Healthy Relationships from the Ground Up. Safe Roots is a 10-week prevention program for children 8 to 14 who have been exposed to domestic violence. The program would be offered through schools and community-based settings such as after-school programs or youth centers. The name Safe Roots connects to the idea that children's early experiences shape how they understand relationships. If a child grows up around violence, control, fear, or unhealthy conflict, those patterns can start to feel normal. This program is designed to intervene early by helping children build a safer foundation. The focus is not just telling children that violence is wrong. The focus is helping them learn what healthy relationships can look like, how to manage emotions, how to communicate safely, and how to identify supportive adults they can turn to. So what are the program's goals and strategies? The overall goal of Safe Roots is to reduce the normalization of unhealthy relationship patterns among children exposed to domestic violence. The strategy is early prevention. Instead of waiting until these patterns show up later in adolescence or adulthood, Safe Roots reaches children while they are still forming their understanding of relationships, conflict, safety, and trust. The program would use weekly small group sessions divided by age group, with one age group being 8 to 10 and the other 11 to 14. An 8-year-old and a 14-year-old are not going to process relationships or trauma in the exact same way. The groups would be led by trained facilitators, such as social workers, counselors, or community partners. The program would also include caregiver or mentor touchpoints and referral connections because support should not stop when the group session ends. So what is Safe Roots' objective and tactics? Safe Roots has 4 main objectives. The first objective is to increase healthy relationship knowledge. The tactic for this is teaching lessons on boundaries, respect, trust, safety, and communication. Children may know what violence looks like, but they may not have had enough exposure to healthy models of conflict or connection. The second objective is to improve emotional regulation skills. Children exposed to domestic violence may experience fear, anger, stress, or confusion. This program would give them age-appropriate coping strategies to practice, such as naming emotions, calming skills, and safe ways to respond during conflict. Our third objective is to increase help-seeking and safety planning knowledge. This includes trusted adult planning, mentorship, and age-appropriate conversations about safety. The point is not to put responsibility on children to solve adult violence. The point is to help them know who they can go to and what support is available. And finally, our fourth objective is to strengthen support outside of the group. That would happen through caregiver or mentor tools and referrals to community services. This helps connect the children's learning to the people and systems around them. Now we can look at our beneficiaries. Our primary beneficiary of Safe Roots are the children ages 8 to 14 who have been exposed to domestic violence. The secondary beneficiaries include caregivers and families, school and youth centers, future peers and partners, and the broader community. If children are supported earlier, it can help improve school functioning, strengthen family support, and even reduce the chance that unhealthy relationships patterns continue into later relationships. This also connects directly to social justice. Children are not exposed to violence equally, and they do not all have equal access to support. Poverty, housing instability, and neighborhood violence can all make it harder for children and families to get help. Safe Roots addresses that by placing support in schools and community settings where children already are. It expands access to trauma-informed support, reduces barriers, challenges the normalization of violence, and works to interrupt the intergenerational cycle of violence before it becomes more deeply rooted. So here's our logic model. This logic model shows how Safe Roots is supposed to create change. First, the program needs trained facilitators, a healthy relationship curriculum, school or community partnerships, mentors, and referral partners. Those are the basic inputs needed to make the program realistic and manageable. From there, the program activities include weekly small group sessions, healthy relationship lessons, emotional regulation practice, and caregiver or mentor touchpoints. The short-term changes we would expect are increased relationship knowledge, stronger coping skills, improved communication, and greater awareness of safe adults. These are the immediate skills and support children should gain during the program. The long-term goal is much larger. We want to reduce the normalization of violence, encourage healthier relationship patterns, increase help seeking, and lower future risk of victimization or perpetration. In other words, the logic is if children are given early support, healthy models, and practical skills, they are far less likely to see violence as normal and more likely to build safer relationships over time. So to know whether Safe Routes is working, we would use both process evaluation and outcome evaluation. Process evaluation asks, did we do what we planned to do? For that, we would track attendance, completion rates, weekly participation, session fidelity, caregiver or monitor or mentor touch points, and referrals to school or community supports. Even a strong program design does not mean much if the program is not actually being delivered consistently. Outcome evaluation asks, did anything change for the children? To measure that, we would use a pre- and post-program healthy relationship knowledge survey, a brief emotion regulation scale, measures of help seeking and safety planning knowledge, teacher or school social worker observations, and a 3-month follow-up check-in. The 3-month follow-up check-in is important because we do not only want to know what the children learned at the end of the program. We want to know whether those skills are still being remembered and used after the program ends. Overall, Safe Routes is designed to fill the early prevention gap our group identified. It gives children exposed to domestic violence a safer foundation for understanding relationships, managing emotions, seeking help, and seeing that violence does not have to be normal.